G'day, welcome to the Reach Australia podcast. I'm Gary Eastman. Central to the vision of Reach Australia is thousands of healthy, multiplying evangelistic churches, and preaching is central to that vision. So we're spending time at the moment in this series talking to preachers at various stages of their ministry about how they approach their craft, about their development over their ministry, and various aspects of how they approach delivering the sermon, keeping their audiences engaged. And I'm very glad to be able to welcome Adam Chung from Cross and Crown in Melbourne. Welcome, Adam.
It's good to be here. Thanks, Gary.
Yeah. Adam, tell us about your ministry. Where are you? How long have you been there?
Yeah, we planted Cross and Crown in 2019. So this is our fourth year of existence. We gathered our launch team in 2018. There were 24 of us. And so 4 years full time now. Yeah.
4 years full time. Now, you are such a swish church. You meet in a ballroom, I think. Is that right?
Yes, we do. We do.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that it's swish, but it's just out of necessity, but it's a good location to reach people with the gospel. So
Yeah, and you've got a couple of hundred people gathering on a Sunday now.
yeah, most Sundays about 180. So
Yeah, that's fantastic, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a great story. So you've been preaching full-time as a lead pastor for a number of years now. A different stage in your ministry to some others that we've spoken to in this series. Not quite an old hand, but getting there.
Still learning, learning.
But Adam, we all started somewhere. Tell us about some early experiences preaching.
Yeah, it's a good question and kind of terrifying to reflect on. I started preaching full-time around 30 when we planted, but then I first started preaching around, I think 20 years old. First sermon was on Hebrews chapter 1 verses 1 to 4.
Right.
And I think my pastor said to me it was everything that you ever need to know about Hebrews in 40 minutes. So he said you could have cut it by about half.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Better to start that way and cut it down rather than the other way around, I guess. Zeal taking it over. Brother, let's talk about your approach to preparation in preaching. I want to start with programming. When do you set your program? How much work do you do at that point?
We set the program very early. I'm a very, very strong J on that Myers-Briggs type indicator,
Right,
so
okay.
I'm a very long-range planner.
Yeah.
We preach over, we plan over a 2-year horizon, over which time we seek to cover 6 sections of the scriptures, and then a doctrine series each year. And what that means is that there's always a sense of predictability in terms of what's coming next.
Yeah.
We know what we're doing. So, for example, we're doing Isaiah 1 to 12 this year, right now. And because we're operating on a 2-year horizon, we'll come back and deal with Isaiah 13 to 39 in 2024. And so every 2 years, we'll revisit the book and track our way through it.
The J is coming through very strongly,
Yes, it is.
Adam. So 2 years out, you're breaking up the passages at that point?
A year out, we'll break up the passages,
Yeah.
But we will have broken up the entire book over actually a number of years horizon. So if it's a book like Isaiah, where there's that many chapters, we will need to have the macro structure of the book a number of years in advance.
Yeah.
But then when it comes to the actual designated weeks, we do that a year in advance.
Besides serving that aspect of your personality that really enjoys that kind of long-range planning, what do you think of the benefits of it?
We're never wondering what's coming next in the sermon, which is great. Or we're never wondering what's coming next or next week. We know what we're preaching. Even when it comes to our annual doctrine series, a year in advance, our staff team and our trainees will sit down and think about what theological doctrine do we need to address?
Yes.
And so actually all of next year is pretty much planned out. I'm not having to think about what to preach next. And when it comes to preparing for a sermon series, I generally work 3 months ahead. So I can actually exegete my way through all the texts in one hit. Not in detail, but at a high level.
Yes.
So that when I come to each week, I'm not wondering, oh, what's in this passage?
Yeah, you're not starting cold.
No,
that's
that's right.
I want to talk about that. So tell us about that 3 months. So you actually get to 3 months out from starting Isaiah, which you've just started at the moment. So you get 3 months ago, which is, what is that, July or August or something. You were sitting down and doing more detailed work on it, mapping out your preaching for this current series. I imagine not doing outlines as such, but just picking up the major themes in each week, or tell us about that.
Yeah, no, that's right. About 3 months out, what I'll normally do is I'll go on Logos Bible software, I'll print off the entire book, double spaced, and then I'll take a red pen and annotate and exegete my way through the text. And I will have already had those segments in terms of the preaching units there. But that way, by just exegeting it all and my way through, it actually helps get a good high level sense of what the text is about.
Yes.
So if it's a New Testament text, I'll print out the Greek and I'll translate my way through it as well 3 months ahead.
Yep.
So that way I'm just slowing myself down to get into the text and notice things that I otherwise wouldn't notice if I came to it cold with the time pressure of 1 week.
Yeah. Now, we're going to come to your week, to your preaching week in a little while. But let me jump ahead here, because that's substantial work. You're a lead pastor. It's a fairly vibrant and growing church. You've got lots going on. You've got people you're training and all that kind of stuff. How do you go defending time for that kind of substantial work? Because, hey, I'm going to work on Isaiah, but it's 3 months' time. That can wait. I'm busy with other stuff. I mean, how do you go defending time for that?
With great difficulty is the first thing. I think it actually really starts with my own time in the Word as a Christian, as a child of God, because it feeds and nourishes my own soul, but also at a very pragmatic level. I would probably have had to read through Isaiah a number of times before I come to preach it. And so if I'm coming to the book cold, never having really engaged with it, that's going to be a problem.
Yes.
But in terms of guarding time, I block out time in my diary.
Yeah.
So I just say, this is what I've got to do. And in making choices, it's always between not good and bad, but good and better.
Yes.
And I think it really comes from how you see your role and what you think grows the church.
Tell us more about that. I love that. Tell us more about that. What you see your role as?
A pastor preacher. So I actually think we lead through our preaching.
Yes.
Because the word grows the church. Murray Capel, who teaches at the Reform College in Melbourne, he says that every pastor is at least 3 things. He says you're a preacher, a leader, and a shepherd.
Yes.
And he goes, they're the 3 main categories that he sees. And I think it's really easy to divide them from each other, to say, when I'm dealing with structures, that's when I'm leading.
Yes.
Or when I'm meeting with an individual, that's when I'm shepherding. But actually, when we preach, we're actually doing leading and shepherding all at the same time.
Yeah, excellent. I imagine that 3 months out work sets you up very well for when you come to your preaching week. Just lead us through that preaching week when you get to start writing. What have you got when you get to Monday morning? You've got last Sunday under your belt and you're heading towards the next Sunday. You know what passage you're preaching, you've done some exegesis. Have you got a sermon structure at that point?
Broadly, I'll probably have a skeleton at best, probably. But then on Monday, effectively, what I pick up is my stack, which is the entire printed out book, annotated.
Just half a felled forest
That's
on
right,
your desk.
That's right.
Yep,
I
okay.
do it, and that's actually quite intentional. I print it out because I feel like there's something about tactile exegesis as
Yes.
opposed to passively staring at a screen.
Yeah.
That really helps when you personally engage with the text at a physical level.
Yeah, I'm very helped by the scribble. I've sometimes done it on the iPad, but yes. on a
I'm
bit of
still
paper.
too dated. I haven't actually quite got to the iPad yet, but one day I'll get there. So
Yes, you might learn from young whippersnappers like me, Adam.
That's right.
Okay, so you're picking up your stack.
Yep.
And you're heading towards, what's the next milestone?
Monday, I'm just trying to get into the text. So I'm still kind of reeling from Sunday. Energy level's not quite there, but I need to get my head in the text. So I'll read it through and revise my exegesis. If it's New Testament Greek, I'll probably retranslate it, because that slows me down.
Yes.
My Hebrew's not quite there yet, or it was, and then it's not.
That's what Logos is for.
That's right.
Yeah,
Right. Tuesday mornings, I generally spend about 3 hours slow exegeting the text.
Okay.
So that's working on detail. When I had gone through it previously, it is at a high level, at quite high speed. Now I'm actually really getting to the guts of the text. I'm trying to structure the text. I'm trying to notice repetition, key themes. One of the key things there on Tuesdays I'm trying to understand is actually the vibe of the thing. I actually think that's really important. I think it's possible to preach a text a bit like an engineer.
Yes.
But actually a text is trying to do something. And so to understand the tone of the text, the emotion behind the text, not just what is the text saying, but what is the text seeking to do in our hearts? That's what I'm really trying to get on my Tuesday mornings.
That's fantastic. We're going to come back to that. When do you have an outline?
Tuesday.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
Tuesday.
So you've got a solid outline for your text. An outline entails what? I always remember asking a trainee for an outline, and sometimes that would be a page and a half of detailed points with subpoints. And for other guys, it would be 2 lines, on 2 dot points. What's an outline for you?
I have to be able to fit it on one A4 sheet of paper, but I actually have a sermon outline template that I have.
Okay.
So I print this same document off every single week.
Yes.
And because I'm a wannabe preacher, all my points alliterate. So I write at the top the text and the title.
Yes.
Then I've got what is the thesis, the thrust, and the tone of the text. So the thesis is what is the text seeking to say in 10 words or fewer. The thrust is what is the text seeking to achieve and accomplish and do in us, 10 words or fewer. And then the tone is what are the emotions in our hearts that the text is seeking to elicit.
That would be an aspect that many people don't pay attention to at this stage.
Yeah.
That sounds very helpful to me. The J also still coming through strongly.
I'm not even done yet. There's theology. So I want to identify the underlying systematic doctrines that anchor the text. So I know how this one text isn't just free floating, but actually sits in with the broader Christian witness of doctrine and theology. So there's a consistency and coherence to what I'm talking about here. So if the text is primarily addresses the atonement, for example, I'll write atonement there. So I can know that when I preach, I'm going to have to engage with that on some level.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it almost forms a checklist.
That's right.
When you're finishing off, if you haven't, okay.
I couldn't find a T word for structure, so I just put trellis. And then the biggest section is actually the trellis, the structure. So I will actually have my introduction listed, then my however many points, could be 3 points starting with P, for example. And then under each one, I will actually scribble in very fine handwritten print the major points of the sermon. I will then go through it with a red pen and add in things like applications and illustrations.
Okay.
So I've got a virtually illegible A4 sheet of paper that only is understandable by me by the end of it.
So when you go to write out your text, I want to ask you how full that is in a second. It sounds like the purpose of an outline for you is to remove friction from the writing process. You just know where you're going at any given point. Yeah. The connections between different sections, all the logical connections are there as well.
They are there. They are there. If I were a better preacher, I should be able to take that A4 sheet of paper up into the pulpit and preach.
Yeah, we've had varying opinions about that, actually, as we've gone through.
I don't do that, but that's. But I think if I were a better public speaker or orator, I'd be able to do that. So
okay. So let's go there. What do you take?
Wednesday. So we're at Wednesday now. This is maybe people would say this is the unnecessary step, but I find it very helpful.
Yes.
I move from a handwritten A4 outline to what I call a detailed outline. That's where I open the Word document and I dot point my way. I basically replicate the A4 sheet of paper, but actually unpack all of it into quite fine detailed dot points onto a Word document.
Yeah.
So I'm not wordsmithing yet. That's to come. But Wednesday, I'm actually putting all of it down into the onto the Word document that I can then come to on the Friday and then wordsmith the precise expression.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all really helpful. How many hours is sorting out? Because it sounds you're a very detailed kind of guy and you're taking a very systematic approach. How many hours do you think on a sermon for you on average, just by the way here?
About 18 to 24.
Okay, yeah. Which is more than many. Yeah. So just so people recognise that, because you are doing lots of terrific work here, but it is taking more time than many would give to their sermons currently. Okay. So you're coming to Friday. That's your wordsmithing.
Yep.
I like that word. So that's your prose.
Yes.
Fairly full text.
Entirely full text.
Entirely full. Okay.
Thursday's my pickling day, so I just kind of let it sit there. So Thursday that's the training day for our trainees, so I ignore it and I come back. But having that extra day of a gap can be really helpful.
Yeah.
Just giving the brain some rest and respite.
Yeah.
On Friday I'm writing full script. I've toyed with a few different ideas. One thing I currently do is, even though the divisions of the genre and structure aren't as this neat, I color code my sermon. So if it's a heavy exegetical section, it's all in black. If it's application, it's in red. If it's illustrations, it's in green. Now, again, they overlap with each other.
Sure.
But my purpose is, behind that, I can flick through my script and I can get a good sense of balance. Okay. How much exegesis, illustration, application feature in this sermon? If there's a prolonged section of exegesis, do I have equal amounts devoted to application to apply it to people's hearts?
Yes.
So if I'm looking at my script and it's pure black, it's probably faithful.
Yes.
Not sure that it's very understandable necessarily. Yeah.
And maybe, and this is the distinction we've worked with a little bit through this series, it might be a lecture more than a sermon.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So colour coding. The J theme is continuing. Thanks, Adam.
It was a 96% on my official report, so just to let you know. So
right. Excellent.
Yeah.
Righto.
Yeah.
This is explaining a few
Yes,
things
that's
as
right.
I'm getting to know you. That's great. Adam, how many words are you taking into the pulpit? I'm going to ask you about sermon length. Wade into that controversy.
Yeah, sure. 3,400.
Not 3,500.
I give myself 100 word leeway, so it's between 400 to 500,
Okay.
and that brings me in, if I'm a good boy and stick to my script, at 33 to 35 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, right. Now, tell us about that length. That's in your context. Why that long? Why do you think you can get away with that long?
Is that long?
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
I think part of it comes down to, there's a number of factors, aren't there? There's your congregational context. So our guys are predominantly, I'd say about 95% plus tertiary educated. They're used to sitting through lectures.
Yes.
So for digesting and ingesting information for that period of time, 35 minutes is on a digestible length, as it were. If they sit through a 50-minute lecture, as it were.
Okay.
Or
So
on
context.
double speed, 25 minutes. So there's the context.
Yeah.
I do think this is harder for me to reflect on personally, but I have heard other people say you need to be able to preach your ability. And so there are people who I know who can go for, I can listen to forever, however long they preach for. So I have once a year generally taken a smaller series where I've taken feedback from key members in the congregation.
Okay.
And so I'll ask them, one of the questions is how they feel about sermon length. And so I'm trying to each week tap out before everyone thinks he should have stepped out of the pulpit.
Yes.
Leave them wanting a little bit more.
Yeah.
But every minute I go beyond the time that I should have stopped isn't just dead time. It's actually regressive. It takes away from what people learnt.
More is not more, just because preaching is important and central to what we do. Okay. Yeah, that's great. There you go. That's Adam's contribution to the sermon length debate.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll come back
I'm not
to
going to
that.
give a number, so...
Okay, yeah. Well, no, you've
I've
said
given my
34
number,
minutes.
my
Yeah.
number, my number.
Your
so.
number in your context.
That's right.
And you are deliberate about getting feedback about that.
Yes.
You're not just going, well, that's what it is, and I'm just going to do that forevermore. That's something you critique from time to time.
Peter Adam once told me when he took a parish in the UK, it wasn't an evangelical parish. They were used to homilies that would go for 10 minutes. And he said by the end of his 3 years there, he got them to 18.
Right. Okay.
So he said you need to start with where the people were, but wanting to grow them. And growing them isn't necessarily a time question, but how much can you do in 10, week to week?
Now that's indeed. Now that's a good distinction, isn't it? It's not just meeting people's comfort levels and meeting them where they were at, because preaching is important. You're going to pastor people and shepherd people through the preaching. So we want to push them a little bit too, but not lose them. Yeah, okay. Now you're going into the pulpit. Let's talk about engagement for a little while. You're a pretty engaging guy. I think very useful to hear from you on this front. You're going up with a full text. You said before, if I was a better public speaker or I was a better preacher or something, then maybe you'd just go up with your dot points. You're not tied to your text though. So you're just getting yourself to a high degree of familiarity with what's there, and you're preaching more or less the words that are there, but your eye contact is up and down. I mean, tell us about that. Or do you just like, that's your safety net, but you just have eye contact all the time? Do you attempt to learn it more fully?
The one time I got food poisoning and I was preaching, I can tell you I stuck to the script pretty closely, and then I stepped off and just went straight home.
Right.
But generally speaking,
I think it's a story I want to hear more about.
No,
there,
well,
anyway,
we won't go there today. So, you're right. I mean, actually, when I'm preparing it, the full script, it's never just in my head. I am preaching it out loud as I am wordsmithing on the Friday.
Yes.
So I've had a good 2 runs at it beforehand, at least, by the time I get into the pulpit.
Yeah.
I do think actually...
Now, sorry to interrupt you. Just
go
about that wordsmithing process, because we have talked about that. There's been a question I've asked others. Do you practice out loud? And not many people we've spoken to just run through the whole thing out loud, but they're trying lines and sections out loud as they go. So they're writing as they speak, not as they write.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right.
Has that evolved as you've gone along? Did you used to... Was there a sort of a college essay type tone to your sermons, and you had to sort of evolve your voice?
I think so. Yes, I think so. Part of the difference is, I think, is a unique circumstance. Before I went into ministry, I was a political speechwriter. So we knew the importance of what we'd call the grab, which is the 1 or 2 liner that you try and get on TV at night. Now, that sounds terrible as a preacher, but actually it's a matter of retention for people.
Yes.
It's helping people lovingly know the key points of the text in a way that will not just hit their head, but land in their heart.
Yeah.
So, yeah, for sure, that was always the tension going through college for me. You know, you want to unpack the text, but I think coming out of college, the temptation is to not have a shape to your sermon.
Yes.
What ends up happening is you want to account for every detail in every verse there in equal measure. And so what ends up happening is the proportion given to every verse is dialed up to 100 right from the beginning. So there's no actual modulation and emphasis within the sermon itself. And actually, I think that's not just poor preaching, it's poor exegesis. Because actually a text has a shape to it as well. So it's about identifying the shape of the text and seeing how that actually matches up with where your congregation's at. And then being able to marry those 2 things in a sermon.
The political background, I can imagine, like you could use suited guys standing behind you, nodding their heads. And,
I've thought about it.
with
I have thought about
points.
it, but...
Yeah, okay. Now, that's excellent, Adam. So let's go into just those engagement points. Do you use a screen?
Yes.
Right. How do you use the screen?
I don't know if this is ultra reformed of me, but no images, only text.
Yeah.
But the text that we display is of, number 1, the structure. So when I'm hitting a major point,
yes,
or a new section, the one-liners, so that it's seen and heard, and biblical text beyond and outside of the primary text we're exegeting.
Excellent. Yeah.
Because we want to actually train our guys to have their Bibles open in front of them. So I'm not going to spoon feed them all the text, but then where there are parts of the scriptures that would take too long to flick to, for example, I'll put them up.
Yeah, I really like that. That reflects, by the sounds of it, you know, not using imagery and not having too much clutter on the screen, if I can put it that way. There is something personal about preaching. There's something relational. And so it's not about engaging with the screen, it's about engaging with you.
But I think that's the point. I think not to overstate it, but Calvin's big point about images was that our hearts will make idols out of any image. Now, I'm not saying that we're going to make an idol out of the PowerPoint slide.
Yeah.
Normally, it's not good enough quality to do that. But I do think it actually can make the preacher, it can make me, I'll speak for myself,
Sure.
it can make me lazier in terms of working on engagement because I'm relying on an external means beyond the word and the preaching of the word to engage people. And actually, when you look at how the Puritans engaged the image, they'd use words to ignite the imagination. The prophets do that as well.
Yeah.
And I think as preachers, that's what we have to do.
Excellent. Adam, tell us, what's a good introduction?
It's hard, Gary, because I'm just preaching Isaiah, and so doing an introduction for the start of a series is different from the start of a sermon necessarily. But I think the best introductions will introduce tension. They'll show the problem that the text is seeking to resolve.
Yes.
There will be a close connection with the text and the thrust of the text. So I actually think this is why understanding the thrust, not just the thesis of the text, is necessary for an introduction.
Yeah.
Because you're not just introducing an idea, you're introducing what the word is seeking to do. And that's where tension interacts there.
Yeah.
So the problem with a lot of illustrations I find is we kind of go, okay, here's the big idea of the text. Here's a theme that the text uses. It's probably a secondary theme. It could be on buildings, for example.
Yeah.
And then I'll use an illustration about building works that were happening with my house the other day. But actually, there's no real engagement, or it's not running with the grain of the text.
Yes.
It's just really there. One of my friends said, they're a dear friend, but they did say in the first 15 seconds, that's your opportunity to say whatever you need to say to get their attention.
Right.
And I thought, that's not quite what an introduction is.
15 seconds.
No, well,
narrow
that's right.
yeah.
But I think you're trying to in an engaging way, create tension and introduce the thrust of the text and what it's seeking to do in a way that's consistent with the grain of the text.
So you're on about, and this is the trap for a lot of introductions, I think, and particularly young preaching. I think of myself here as a younger preacher, about engaging people with you and getting them to like you rather than engaging with the text and the thrust of what's going on there.
Do an interview beforehand if that's the case. So Mike
Right.
Rader says when he preaches as an itinerant preacher all around the place, he goes, I always want an interview.
Right.
Because that will do the work for me in terms of introducing me to the congregation.
Yes.
Now, if you're the pastor, they know you and you know them, right? But that's not what your introduction's for. You're actually framing the text in a way, even at a meta level that people might not be consciously aware of. You're framing the text and introducing the themes and ideas that the rest of the text will pick up on with and engage.
Yeah. It's excellent. You mentioned before modulation. Marbo, the vibe, I think.
The
I
vibe, that's
mentioned as
right,
well.
that's
Yeah,
right.
Okay.
Dennis Denudo is one of the greatest lawyers in Australian history. He's not real though. But,
And if listeners don't understand that reference, they need to go and watch the cast
That's right.
and get educated. Okay. So, Adam, tell us about modulation. Now, one of the things you've already really inferred is it's the text drives it, the mood of the text. It'll have a relationship to that. But what does it mean for you to engage people in your different modes of speech?
I find this quite personally challenging on one level. I don't find it challenging because I am a reasonably emotional person.
Right.
So I have a kind of broader emotional bandwidth as such. So that helps on one level. I find it hard because if the text drives the tone, sometimes I'm not going to like the tone of the text, and it's going to put me as a preacher in a very uncomfortable position. So, for example, last week we were preaching on 3 pictures of pride in Isaiah chapters 2 to 4. That is a very convicting text. And if I adopt the tone of the text, it takes a fair bit of courage that I often feel like I'm lacking. So I need to be convinced of my place as a preacher and not preaching in such a way, or what does Paul say in 1 Thessalonians 2, so we speak, not to please men, not even you, but to please God.
Yes.
I actually think that's really hard. To give a lecture where you're giving a floating thought out there, that's a hard point, that's one thing. But actually look at people you love in the eye and say a hard thing. If that's where the text is leading you, it's tough. But on engagement, I'm trying to do a few different things. My tone, again, needs to reflect the text. the genre, not just of the text, but my sermon needs to be varied. What do I mean by that? I've heard preachers, and I know I do this a lot myself, whether they're exegeting, illustrating, or applying, the tone always sounds like a proposition.
Yes, right.
So actually, it sounds like he's just hitting the same tone the whole way through, even though they're ticking off the check boxes when it comes to illustration and application. Becoming a master of silence, that's hard.
Now, it's just worthwhile pointing out, isn't it? That tone might be a really kind of engaging, bouncy tone. It just might not be droll. It might be quite a helpful, engaging, I'm energetic.
Yep.
But if it's the same all the way through, a whole lot is lost.
That's right. There are some preachers where you can actually chart in terms of how their voice modulates in a sentence.
Yes.
Because it's the same way every single sentence.
Yes, right.
Silence, as I said, is a great way to break or to create tension in many ways. I've heard Peter Adam preach. He's silent for so long that you wonder if he's still there. Yes. So it makes people. We think that high volume is a way of engaging people, but actually stepping back is quite powerful.
Yeah, dropping down, leaving silence, and inviting the listener to go, oh, hang on, that really was significant what was just said. I need to grab that and ponder it for a second.
If my great mistake early, because I moved quite fast, is if I ask a very penetrating question, I need to pause.
Yes.
And however long I think I pause in my head, I should wait even longer. Because the pauses in my head feel longer than they actually are in reality.
Yeah.
And so I need to learn how to just sit with that. Or when I ask the question, don't break eye contact. Pan the room. Let it sit and seep into people's hearts.
Yeah.
And that could be the most powerful moment of the sermon. When you ask that one question and just let it sit with people.
Love it. That's really, now that takes time. Something I've mentioned, I think, in each episode is that I've heard from young guys, I'm not sure I'm a preacher. I don't feel like I'm doing that well in the pulpit. But you've just mentioned something that I think is an aspect of the craft and skill of preaching that takes time to develop. There's some confidence and courage required for that kind of moment, I think. Not self-confidence so much as confidence in the text and to play the role that you are called to play as a preacher in bringing that to bear on people. And you're using, God has chosen to use a human relational means, preacher to people, and there you are as an embodied creature, pausing, eye contact, and so on. So, Adam, tell us about application for you. Now, there's a relationship to the tension that you've set up in your introduction or perhaps elsewhere on the way through. What makes a good application?
Again, I sound like a broken record. The application itself has to come and flow from the text.
Yeah, sure.
I think this is what happens a lot of the time. We do a fair job, if not a great job, on the exegesis. We see the thesis statement, whatever it is, the big idea, as it were. We don't engage with the thrust sufficiently.
Yes.
And then we don't springboard the exegesis. We're well taught to not do that.
Yeah.
But we springboard our application.
Yeah.
And we go, here's the theme of the
springboard. What do you mean?
We identify something in the text that might be valid, but then we use it as a springboard. We jump on it and leap to another point that will be driven by another agenda. And so there's a discipline. It means, for example, that if my application is running with the grain of the text, there will be things I want to say that have happened that week in church that will just be eating me up. That the text constrains me to not say, because actually that the text doesn't address those particular things. So I can't. It's a helpful pastoral restraint actually, because it stops me from abusing the pulpit. To be blunt. You actually have to apply the text as the text invites being applied.
It seems to me your long J-driven application process would protect you from that as well. So I think a lot of that springboarding, as you called it, comes from, gee, it's been a busy week. I'm really not on top of the text. I'm not sure what I'm going to say. And that's where those things come in. Whereas your long run at it is part of the guarding against that, I think. Okay, so springboarding for application.
Secondly, I think I heard this throwaway line in a podcast, another one, a number of podcasts ago that Rory Shiner did, and I found it really helpful. Pastor through your preaching. A pastor through your preaching. My application, I know people take different views on this, but I heard that there was one evangelical preacher in the revivals, it may have been Wesley or Whitefield, he would burn his sermons after he preached them because he said that actually this was for this particular people.
Yeah, right.
It's the risk of podcasting these days that we preach to such a big audience, but actually the people that God has given us are before us.
Yes.
And as a pastor preacher, my call is actually for these people in front of me.
Yeah.
So I'm seeking to apply the text to them and pastor them through it. So that means, and again we miss this being Western individualists, realizing that God's word is often written to God's people collective, not just individuals. So a good application will not just have how is your individual heart, as important as that is, but it will have as its goal church formation. Our life together as the people of God. English misses this with the one you in singular and plural, but so often that God's word is for God's people.
Yeah.
And so I'm seeking to pastor through my preaching as well in my application.
Well, let's actually take a moment. We've got a grab from one of your recent sermons. It's Isaiah. We're going to have a listen to that now. I'm going to ask you to make some comment on that once we've had a listen to that.
And so comes the penetrating question of verse 22 to all of us. Put no more trust in a mere human who has only the breath in his nostrils. What is he really worth? Just let that sink in. I'll read it again. Let that sink in. Put no more trust in a mere human who has only the breath in his nostrils. What is he really worth? You know, over the last few weeks, right, we've been seeing Judah rely on anyone but God. And you might have heard that, seen that, and gone, yep, I get that, right? It is futile to rely on other people. You might have realized that actually running from person to person, relationship to relationship, hoping against all hope that the next person will give you what all the others couldn't, it's just not going to work out. And you may have settled on this conclusion. I guess I can't trust anyone. I guess I'll have to just rely on myself. I'm not going to expect anything from anyone, and I'm not going to owe anyone anything. I'm going to work hard. I'm going to earn a lot of money. I'm going to provide for my family. And you know what? I'm not going to rely on anyone else to get there. I'll have a secure life where I don't have to rely on a handout from anyone. But don't worry. I'll be generous, right? I'll be good. I'll be kind. I'll give other people a handout. They can rely on me, as I just won't rely on them. It sounds noble, doesn't it? But I hope you can see it's actually just proud. Because it refuses to admit our own weakness, our own limitation, our own need. It says that by our own effort and power, I am strong enough. It says that I'm God. But I'm not. We're not. We're a human who has only the breath in his nostrils. And Isaiah asked this question, what is he really worth? Or maybe let's sharpen a little bit. What are you really worth? What am I really worth? Can you rely on yourself? Can you really put your trust in yourself? I mean, we're just as finite, limited, and mortal as anyone else. What makes us think that we're more reliable than they? Now, we need to rely on someone who is more than a mere human. Someone who lives forever. Someone who cannot fail. Someone who cannot die. And Jesus is the only human who has ever done that. Jesus is more than merely human. No, Jesus is fully human and He's fully God. He cannot fail and He cannot die. So friends, can you hear Isaiah's message? Put no more trust in a mere human. Put your trust in the true human. Put your trust in Jesus. He's the only one who's worthy of our trust.
Adam, makes me want to keep listening. It's a shame to chop that off. Appreciate your work, brother. A couple of features that stand out to me in that section of application, repetition of that question at the start. It's a penetrating question. The second time you asked the question, you slowed it down. There was a bit of a pause afterwards. Was that written in, the repetition of the question, or were you responding to the moment?
Responding to the moment.
Right.
Responding to the moment on that one.
Yeah.
So I think preaching is also a dialogical process, right? It's not just a monologue.
Yes.
You're looking at the people and feeling that moment with your congregation.
Yeah. So that would have impacted, because your pace, you were talking about your modulating your pace before. There was an urgent, faster pace through a section of that, but then you slowed it right down at a couple of points as well. There was some minor pausing in it. Tell us about the taking of your exegeting, or you're taking that reliance on merely human concept and applying it to the concept of self-reliance. What did you see in our culture, or your reading of the congregation? I just thought that was really helpful, the way you discerned that people might respond to that being let down by others to being self-reliant. That just came through in your reflection in the preparation process?
Yeah, partly again, broken record, text driven. I think part of it is throughout Isaiah, Israel has relied on every other nation, Syria, Israel, Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, that you just reel them off.
Yes.
And in the end, what sits at the heart of it is actually self-reliance rather than God-reliance.
Yes.
But then also, it was in preaching the weeks before, when we were talking about relying on others and not God, that I was speaking with a number of people in the congregation.
Yes.
And talking with them and hearing, hey, have you found Isaiah, right? I often find it very awkward, how did you find the sermon? I don't really ask that.
Sure.
It's a bit, awkwardly fishing and bad for your own heart.
Yeah.
But I ask, how are you finding Isaiah?
Yeah.
Well, we're covering in small groups and sermons. How have you found the text?
That's an excellent question.
And people said, one of the non-Christians in our church, actually, she said, it's easy for me, I have learned to not rely on other people. Because I just rely on myself.
Okay, yeah.
And I thought, well, that's it, isn't it?
Fascinating.
That's it, isn't it?
Yeah.
And actually, now, I had to be careful. I'm like, is that actually reflective of the text?
Yeah.
Is it coherent and consistent with the text? And actually it is. Which is why I think in that section that we just listened to, the anchor question in that verse, I think verse 22 is, what is he really worth? Making it an inclusio at the very end and sharpening it, what are you really worth?
And then you iterated it further. You said, what am I really worth?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is when you're doing sharp application,
Yes.
Thinking about the second person versus the first person inclusive is important. Meaning, if you're doing sharp application, if you're just saying you,
Yes.
it can actually put a few noses out of joint and make it less heard and less clear. But actually, given that this is about a human problem, the preacher including himself and humbling himself within that is actually quite important, so people can hear it more clearly.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Yeah. The Christology then, jumping to Jesus, who is more than a human and can be utterly relied on. Thank you for that moment of encouragement for myself. Very, very helpful. Let's just finish with thinking about two audiences. You went clearly to Jesus in that point. We had to chop it off. So I'm wondering, I'm going to go home and listen to that sermon just for my own benefit. But are you always explicit when it comes to two audiences, speaking to the non-believer in the room?
Yes. So it's driven by 1 Corinthians 14. You assume that the unbeliever is in the room.
Yeah.
Though your application actually has to be quite different for them, because God's word is written to God's people. And so they've got to be there looking over the shoulder, as it were.
Yes.
I think it's the challenge. I think I'm not a natural evangelist, which ironically pushes me to maybe overdo the non-Christian application at times. So you do need to make sure that actually the primary audience is the people of God.
Sure.
Whilst also addressing the non-Christian. That is a priority, and there was a period of time in the first year where I started to slip, and one of the new Christians said to me, a few months ago you always used to talk to the non-Christian and directly address them. I haven't heard that the last few weeks.
Yes.
And I thought, okay, I must make that a priority. So,
yeah. Why is it important, do you think? 1 Corinthians 14, you're acknowledging that reality, but just extend that a little bit. Why is it important?
I think there's so many reasons. I think one of them is you should never even presume that everyone in your congregation is necessarily saved.
Sure.
So it will actually hit more of your congregation than you think. It will train and equip your congregation to see how the text applies to their non-Christian friends and how they can talk about it with others as well. So I think there's multiple benefits that are there. And preaching is a culture, it's not just a... Preaching is the primary culture shaping part of our ministry. And if we stop preaching to the non-Christian, we will see the evangelistic and mission heat in our church go down.
So helpful.
And so what our preaching will surface not just what our theology is, it will surface what our values are.
Yeah.
And it will shape our church culture. So how we preach, or what we preach for, is the church that we get under God, as it were.
Adam, it's been so great talking to you, hearing a little bit about your ministry, from the desk to the pulpit, hearing the J come through. It's been excellent. I'm sure others will be blessed by hearing this as well. Blessings for your ministry. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Gary.